Hello to YouTube, Twitch, Discord, and the Tiki Talkie. Um, yee. Sorry the reading is late today. We had a lecture in the server, and the lecture was on a book called Someday Everyone Would Have Been Against Us, writing about uh, the media, Palestine, and how narratives are framed, and essentially fixing a world that is very, very fucked. So yeah, today we continue with the reading Abolition Feminism Now. I have the wrong thing on Twitch and YouTube. It is by Angela Davis, Gina Dent, Erica Mayners, and Beth Ritchie. And this coalition of brilliant writers came together to write about not just abolition and not just feminism, but what it means to be an abolition feminist. Because it's not enough to just be an abolitionist, it's not enough to just be feminist. It is abolition feminism, which is a form of feminism that essentially is against the prison industrial complex and the carceral system that exists, especially as in its US iteration today. And this is a conversation I was having with my mother recently about the state disappearing people. And whenever there's somebody undesirable, there's a sense of the state can disappear them whenever, however it sees fit. And so disappearing people requires a sense of not just superiority or a sense of authority over them, but it is a control of a sense of who belongs and who doesn't. And for me, I've always struggled with the sense of home. I am of stolen people and I live on stolen land. I'm not indigenous, nor am I a settler. And so I've always struggled with the sense of home. And the apartheid government had, and even prior to the apartheid regime, the powers, the imperial powers in South Africa had a knack of being able to disappear people quietly and efficiently. And this is exactly what the prison industrial complex is, and this is what ICE is. It is about disappearing people who are considered undesirable. And so, we are against the prison industrial complex and the carceral system, which is definitely tied into the legal system, which makes lawyers cops, which is something that a friend and I were having a conversation about a couple of weeks ago, that I've never seen lawyers as extension of the police, because lawyers really helped our cause in fighting apartheid. But essentially lawyers are cops, because it depends about where they work in the carceral system, in the criminal justice system, and who they work for and how they operate. But I am getting completely monkey minding off topic here. Last week, when reading, we stopped at the beginning of the second chapter, where they were talking about it is a feminist imperative to acknowledge intersectionalities of struggles as explicit in politics and praxis. And how does that look in current abolitionist mobilizations? How does that look in feminist mobilizations? And how can abolition work in a feminist anti-violence framework? And now they're going into talking about the actual organizations and mobilizations that have existed in the US over the past few years. And so page 86, if you want to follow along, Insight. The abolitionist feminism at work in the moment of truth statement emerged as a consequence of long-term and persistent organizing, coupled with deep thinking about that work, represented by the histories with which this book engages. Here we offer snapshots from one particular origin story, the founding of Insight, Women of Color Against Violence, later, Women, Gender Nonconforming, and Trans People of Color Against Violence. While Insight was not alone in pioneering new intersectional analyses, we believe it played a critical role as it attempted to interrupt the political effects of criminalization, as it strongly reprimanded those feminisms that raced to embrace carceral solutions. And if a wave or a form of feminism is leaning into the carceral system, it is not for all women, femmes, and gender diverse people. It cannot be feminist. It cannot be for all women. For Insight, the call for change came primarily from women of color activists in the late 90s, who firmly insisted that after 30 years of trying to reform anti-violence organizations from the inside, it was time to turn to more radical work. And that's usually the case, isn't it? That you try to change things from the inside and then you realize, well, fuck. Women of color activists who had dedicated our lives to working against the tyranny of gender violence and for justice for our communities found ourselves struggling for years to remake organizations that offered simplistic neoliberal responses to complex problems. These groups unquestionably assigned blame to individual perpetrators of violence rather than looking more deeply into oppressive social structures, whose culpability is ideologically foreclosed. This more radical work was necessary because by the late 90s, a social justice-oriented anti-violence movement had been effectively co-opted by the state, and anti-violence programs, had been transformed from a network of radical grassroots self-help groups into highly professionalized service-based industries. And this is around the world. This is how it happens. The language of resistance is co-opted to water it down. Hi, B. In 2000, a small group of 18 women of color anti-violence organizers decided to finally and absolutely reject the reformist project of trying to hold dominant anti-violence organizations accountable for their complicity with and reliance on the carceral state. This group had gathered for the purpose of honing an analysis of gender violence that accentuated its relation to state violence, especially within the context of racism. Determined to contest existing leadership paradigms, they decided unapologetically to refuse compromises that marginalized race, class, sexuality, immigration status, or disability as secondary issues. In the very process of this deliberate organizing and collective theorizing, they were embarking on a path that transformed political fatigue and frustration into joyful revolutionary rage. I love that. Joyful revolutionary rage. And I wish I had the energy for joy, but all I have is rage. Yes. Hi. What? Sleepy time? Okay. What? All of that? That's clean. Okay. Oh.
What?
I love you. You're handsome. Yeah, all I have is rage. As was later the case for the moment of truth statement, the call was not to only critique what was wrong or inadequate, but also, and even more importantly, to build larger liberation movements, without which we would never end gender violence. Anti-violence organizations like the Coalition Against Rape and Abuse, Sister to Sister, the Audre Lorde Project, and Insight embraced these analyses developing and practicing on-the-ground responses to gender and sexual violence, often explicitly identifying as abolition feminist formations. Like Critical Resistance, Insight began in convening in the year 2000, reflecting a hunger for the radical ideas and practices. The conference, The Color of Violence, Violence Against Women of Color, was organized with a number of goals. First, the conference planners hoped to provide an opportunity for women of color activists to revise and deepen radical analyses and corresponding strategies around ending gender violence by centering anti-racist and anti-imperialist struggles. The idea that it is just individual perpetrators rather than a system, and I've said it before, it means that it is ignoring the structures that not only enable but allow violence of this magnitude and of this nature to continue. Ignoring the fact that it is the entire carceral system means that you put the onus on one or two prisons that, like, the fight to close Rikers Island. They're like, no, that one is bad, but everywhere else is good. It's Derek Chauvin who's bad. Not all cops are bad. All cops. It's when we say all, we mean all. ACAB all day, every day. We're talking about the system of policing, the system of incarceration, the system of violence against women, femmes, and gender non-conforming or gender diverse people. We cannot ignore the system, because if we ignore the system and put it on individuals primarily, it is the state, it is society, it is individuals within that society sanctioning that violence and saying this can be allowed to continue because we refuse to fix the system that enacts this violence or that allows this violence or sees it as not a problem at all. And this is something that Pumla Qola was talking about in the book Rape, a South African Nightmare, where violence against all forms of sexual violence in South Africa. I mean, it's the so sexualized, racialized sexual violence. It's gendered violence. All of those forms of violence are allowed to be perpetuated because it feeds into a patriarchal system. And ultimately, it feeds into the capitalist system. But more on that another time. The vision was less about emphasizing how the work had become more conservative and more about reclaiming the political power that characterized early women of color-led activism around gender violence. It was an attempt to reverse the fact that we won the mainstream but lost the movement. Second, conference organizers hope to revoke the tendency to consider gender violence in isolation from other forms of violence. It cannot be isolated from other forms of violence. Moving beyond merely responding to partner violence and sexual assault, this more expansive approach led the inclusion of immigrant rights, indigenous treaty rights, and reproductive justice, as well as the violence of incarceration and militarism. This more inclusive analysis also identified a profound and persistent harm of homophobia and heterosexism within mainstream movement work. Shaped by abolitionist organizing and feminist analysis, Insight advanced the idea that gender violence was systemic and symptomatic of larger patterns of oppression. Importantly, the conference agenda encouraged practical involvement in political organizing campaigns and, centrally, a transition from providing highly regulated emergency crisis intervention services toward advancing social justice strategies to ensure safety rather than reactionary response. And I've said it before, and I will say it again, the fact that all emergency services for service numbers reach the police first is a problem, because it makes systems of community care then criminal systems, criminal issues, which not everything is a criminal issue. Addiction is not a criminal issue. It is a mental health issue. These goals, with an implicit focus on what we might now call abolition feminism, grew out of the concern that the once radical analysis of gender violence had become so mainstream that essential elements of the movement had been erased. And this is why I say, absolutely, I do not think in feminist thought. I think in thought of, I have thoughts of equity and analysis of intersectionality, ultimately proletarianism, because I'm here for the working class. Because feminism, thinking about it in waves of feminism, is a Euro and American centric white way of looking at things. Feminist thought and ideas and activism existed long before the suffragette movements on both continents. For example, the legacy of black lesbians and the contributions of other feminists of color who had simultaneously worked within community-based racial justice groups and within predominantly white feminist organizations were entirely excluded from the dominant collective movement memory. In a righteous celebratory atmosphere, the Color of Violence Conference recentered the radical anti-racist work that activated the movement to end gender violence in the first place. The mere idea of the Color of Violence Conference ignited infectious energy. The enthusiasm made it clear that women of color had yearned for years for such a space and were ready to propel this work forward based on the mandates of abolition feminism. Women of color across the country and beyond the US borders went to great lengths to attend, including pooling scarce resources, arranging for coverage at home, driving for days to reach California. White folk name things to claim them. Exactly. Like, what race are you? So they can see that race in relation to whiteness. Okay. Riddle me this. How did people who are allergic to the sun pull such a number on the majority of the world? How did such mediocre people pull such a fast one? How did they colonize more than 80% of the world? Is it they used to strike at dawn because it wasn't a war strategy or a conquering strategy, but it was skincare? I don't know, tell me. Originally planned for 200 participants, the first Color of Violence conference ultimately drew 1,000 people. Another 1,000 people who wanted to attend were turned away for lack of space. To address the historical legacy of racism within the anti-violence movement, strong measures were taken to ensure that this time the conversation would proceed differently. The conference allowed only a small number to attend who were not women of color. Others who participated were required to sponsor attendance for women of color. Encouraged not to dominate main sessions, instructed not to participate in strategy sessions unless specifically invited to do so. Narcissistic tendencies, yeah. The linear versus circular thought, the difference of Western and Eastern cultures, yeah. And I like that there's a creator on here named Daddy Swanberry. I think I've mentioned her before, but I don't think she likes me very much. Fair. She only lets black people on her panel if they are not opposition. And a lot of people have come in and said that kind of thing is exclusionary. It is not exclusionary. It is creating a space where people who have the same lived experience can absolutely have those conversations in a space that is by them for them. And I don't see a problem with it. Exactly, Charles. 100%. And I learned so much sitting in the comments. The only time I ever request is when I cannot be tapping the screen. And that is algorithm camping. So, and I tell her in the chat, I am algorithm camping. I am algo camping. I'm sitting in the request to boost the live. Of course, she won't bring me up. Every now and then a moderator will boot me from the requests because they don't know. But that's fine. If you are in a space like that and you hit that request button and you are not a person of color, if you are not black in a black person space, in a black centered space, if you are not a person of color in a BIPOC centered space, if you are not queer in a queer centered space and you are hitting that request button, you better have a damn good reason why. Because you cannot center yourself in those spaces. Even if it's just to say hi, you are detracting from the conversation. And this is phenomenal. The idea that people who are not of color were instructed to not participate in the strategy sessions unless they were specifically, explicitly invited to do so, that is powerful. Because it is telling them outright that, yes, you are welcome to listen, you are welcome to participate, but you do not get to dominate the narrative. Because ultimately, what happens as soon as a white person enters a BIPOC-centered space, it becomes about whiteness. It becomes about our identity in relation to whiteness. It becomes about white feelings. It becomes about white sensibilities. And it becomes about coddling whiteness so that we have the support of white people. Fuck that shit. This was more than a series of symbolic gestures. It solidified the insistence that the work of insight would not be concerned with negotiation, appeasement, or even challenging mainstream anti-violence activists about their failures, especially when it came to race. Instead, the work was about strategically and enthusiastically advancing an anti-racist, anti-capitalist analysis of gender violence and recentering social justice and freedom. Since then, for over 20 years, grassroots chapters and affiliates of Insight across the US have organized broad-based social justice campaigns to link gender violence to other forms of harm. Insight has always been a voluntary collective, without paid staff, except for episodic and discrete tasks associated with planning conferences, producing political educational materials, or developing social media campaigns. In New Orleans, for example, the chapter supported low-income and uninsured women of color after Hurricane Katrina, demonstrating how they were the ones pushing for the survival of their communities when government and nonprofit responses continued to perpetuate abusive and harmful practices. What was the government's response to Katrina? Okay, Venus, honey. That's happened. That has happened. The reverse has happened to us time and time again in far more harmful ways than just not being allowed into a space. And now, we want to claim our spaces. It is in response to white supremacy. Us needing safe spaces away from white people? That is us preserving our own sanity, our own cultures, our languages, everything that whiteness has taken away from us or attempted to take away from us over centuries. So don't bring up this, what if it's the reverse? Nonsense. Because it's bullshit. You know it's fuckery. They ignored impoverished black and brown folks for weeks before they even tried to get them water or food. The faster response was law enforcement chasing down looters. Good Lord, yeah. They told people within hours to evacuate, and that was an economic hardship. Mm-hmm.
They also purposely only gave funding when the rebuild happened to upper white class communities or middle class white people. They specifically left an entire section of the city with next to no repairs, and they gave them the least amount of money based on property value as well.
So when it comes to community building, this is why we say communalism. Community, the collective, over any form of individualism, any form of government reliance even. Oh no, yes, I agree with Shells. It's not sad. It's dehumanizing. Grassroots organizations have always stepped in where government and even and official social justice or social programs have failed. Civil society has always been the go-between, the space between the inadequacy of government and the irresponsibility of social programs. Shells, look how Venus left. This is what happens when white people are uncomfortable. They don't sit in their discomfort. They leave. Or they make nasty comments. And then leave. Always. The Philadelphia chapter organized around housing and gentrification, while Brooklyn's Insight affiliate, Sister to Sister, worked against the sexual harassment of women of color by the New York Police Department. The National Insight Collective organized conferences and movements, including Building a Movement in 2002 in Chicago, Stopping the War on Women of Color in 2005, In New Orleans, the revolution will not be funded beyond the non-profit industrial complex in 2004. Yes, this is something that we do need to have conversations about. The role of the non-profit in placating the people. In Santa Barbara, California, and beyond the state, inciting radical possibilities in 2015 in Chicago. In order to share political analyses and to achieve this radical work, Insight published 2 anthologies, The Color of Violence, the Insight Anthology in 2006, including writings from 33 radical feminists of color with a sharp focus on federal Indian law, adoption policy, reproductive justice, Palestinian resistance, and law enforcement. 4 years after the 2004 conference, Insight published The Revolution Will Not Be Funded, Beyond the Nonprofit Industrial Complex, which explored the impact of the nonprofit system on revolutionary movement building. It waters it down. Circulating globally, these forms of political education, like the Community Accountability Toolkit and the Anti-Militarism Toolkit, have deepened the project of abolition feminism and, in turn, reshaped contemporary anti-violence work. These feminist abolitionist communities came together out of a sense of desperation, as well as a place of love and honor that in later years proved to be much more complicated. But a sense of frustration and feeling of betrayal from abandoned commitments of solidarity from collaborators did not dissuade the organizers who continued to do the work. Those who had initially responded to the Insight call brought energy, hope, and the conviction that a different way was possible. And this is something that we were saying earlier. Let me look in the chat for what was said. The work of liberation is intertwined with the work of imagination. It really is imagining a different world, a world that works for people. This optimism, which brought a sense of urgency and belief in the possibility of anti-violence work that resonated more broadly, was infectious and quickly spread across the country and beyond US borders. At the same time, this overarching optimism managed to overshadow important disagreements and enduring controversies. Formalized local chapters, loose affiliates, and countless individuals considered themselves members of Insight, engaging in small and large resistance projects, protesting new prisons, providing mutual aid, collective reading and writing for political education campaigns, and, most importantly, supporting survivors of gender violence in all its varied forms. Insight also confronted harm within its own ranks and struggled with internecine. I don't know how to pronounce this word. Tensions and betrayals. Among the most serious failures of the 20-year history of Insight was the initial exclusion of trans people in the framing of the work. It is now virtually axiomatic that any effective challenge to gender violence must center the multiple violences inflicted on trans and gender non-conforming people. Like many networks, Insight struggled to establish systems of accountability and transparency. More recently, widely publicized investigations regarding Indigenous identities of founding members have come to light. These are critical aspects of Insight's history that must be factored into any story of its achievements. In exploring genealogies of abolition feminism, it should be pointed out that Insight's influence as a movement and political identity embodying a radical abolition feminism went far beyond its influence as an organization. Even as it struggled, sometimes unsuccessfully, with an array of organizational problems, the enduring legacy of Insight's anti-capitalist, anti-racist internationalism is what drives abolition feminism. And yes, we have to look at organizations in all its forms, in all their ugliness, in all of their failures. Which is why when we say Black Lives Matter, we're not only talking about the organization, we're talking about a movement. And we have to recognize the failures of the Black Lives Matter organization. It doesn't mean that we still don't say Black Lives Matter, because they absolutely fucking do. An ongoing challenge to carceral feminism is a collective commitment to end all forms of violence, from the bedroom to the streets to police stations and prison cells. It is a collective commitment to forge new futures grounded not in violence, but in the flourishing of life. And just because a movement can fail every now and then, or have serious problems within the movement itself, within the organization, it doesn't mean that the message is invalid. And that is what individualism does, is it singles out little things, individual people, little problems, tiny little things that says everything's a failure. So you have to trust the system that still exists. That's what's wrong. And why people will do anything and everything to center themselves. Absolutely. Every single South African person who is in anti-racist work will know a guy named the Kifness. And to the Kifness, if you ever come across this video, fuck you. He was doing the whole performative work of, oh, I'm anti-racist, oh, I'm Black Lives Matter and all of that stuff. He was saying all the right things. Very, very performative. Had to make a point that he was doing something that was, quote unquote, not racist. And he didn't get coddled for it. He didn't get all of this. Congratulations, you're doing the work. Oh my God, you're a white person who's not racist. Well done. He didn't get that kind of response. So then he showed his true colors. Yeah. And that is the chapter. It is quite short. And I'm not going to get on to the next one because I am tired. This silly goose needs to do a thesis proposal. So any questions? Right? And why I find it so good is that it shows us looking at how these movements were run, looking at how these movements had kind of like a sense of, how do I put this? How they rooted themselves in anti-racist, anti-capitalist thought and analysis, how they were able to mobilize from there. And mobilization is ultimately where it's at, right? And so, yeah, even though it had its issues, it was a really good movement. So I'm going to end it there. I know that on TikTok and Twitch, I forgot to update the stream information. So you're going to have the absolutely wrong title and whatnot. But yeah, what to do. I forgot. I shall see you all on Tuesday on Twitch and YouTube. Tuesday, we'll be back to reading the actual thing that's in the description. And yeah, remember that I have a $115 goal. I know it's a lot. It's more than I usually put up for my goal, but I do these readings for free. So please, if you can, please help me out. I owe my mother some money. joy. Yeah. So have a good weekend.